Is it working? Did we do it? Okay. Can anybody see me? Somebody text me. You've already been texting me. Let's see. Is it going now? I don't know why, but this was not allowing me on for so long, so I have no idea. Okay, it seems like people are joining. Okay, perfect. So I guess we figured this out. I even tried to get a head start on it and go live 5 minutes early, and it still didn't want to work. So my sincerest apologies, everybody. We are, just working one step at a time here. Okay. All right. So I guess this is live because people are texting and commenting on this. Very good. Well, again, thank you y'all so much for your patience. I know this was supposed to go live at 2, and next week it will go live on time now that I've figured out how to make this work properly. Um, anyway, but it's 2:09 and we're ready to go. Hopefully y'all are at home and ready to jump into the Gospel of John. So a little bit of background on this study before we get rolling. This is an adapted version of a study that John Scott and I, our lay family minister, had been doing on Sunday mornings before all of everything that's been happening. And it is based off of this study by Adam Hamilton, John, the Gospel of Light and Life, which you can find on Amazon or anything like that if you'd like to order the book. Although, now that I'm doing it in this format, it is very loosely based on this study because we won't be watching any of the videos or anything like that that come with the study. But if you want to know where the basic outline of all of these sessions and everything comes from, it comes from that book. So feel free to jump on and order a copy of that. Adam Hamilton's great. I enjoy all of his stuff, and I'm sure you will too. All right, so the only thing that you really need to fully participate in this study is a Bible, or even just a collection of the Gospels, because we're only going to be talking about one of them, the Gospel of John. We'll be going for about the next, I have 6 sessions prepared for this, so we've got at least that many times that we can meet here digitally, and I'm hoping that this can be a forum for us to not just engage in our faith formation together as a community, even though we're kind of at a distance and doing this digitally, but it can also just be a way for us to connect. I know I'm doing this on Facebook Live this week. Next week, what I'm going to try to do is maybe do it as a Zoom meeting that will simultaneously post as a Facebook Live video. Given how much trouble I had with Facebook Live just now, you can see why I didn't want to do that this week, but I might try to do that next week and in future sessions, and the benefit of doing it that way will mean that I can share my screen with you so that we can look at specific passages or things like that as we go along. Anyway, so that's what we'll be doing. I also see that a lot more of you are hopping on. Thank you. I'm really excited about this. So, let's get started. What are we going to talk about today? Today, I thought we would talk about the context of the Gospel of John, talk a little bit about the background, about the history of the Gospel itself, so that we can prepare to dive in to the text next week, although we will talk a little bit about the introduction to John's Gospel, John chapter 1 today. So we will talk a little bit about that. As I've mentioned in some of the promotional materials for this study, if you leave questions and stuff in the comments, I'll try to answer all of those. I would love to engage with y'all that way. If you have any questions that you don't want to put in the comments, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to respond to you that way as well. And then I will be posting a link to the PDF of my own notes for each session. So you can look at my outline. The outline goes into a little greater depth than I'll be able to in these videos, and each one of those outlines contains at the bottom of it a set of questions for reflection that can hopefully help you as we all kind of journey through the gospel together. All right, so that's enough preamble from me. Let's go ahead and dive in. As I said, today we'll be talking about the context of John's Gospel, and I have all my notes on my iPad. So that's what I'm doing, is looking over there. So when it comes to dating the Gospels, of course there are four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and I guess we should begin there. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels, which Rich likes to remind us that the word synoptic means with one eye. And those three Gospels are so called because they share a very, very close relationship. If you've read Mark and then you've gone over and read Matthew, you'll notice, there's a parable over here in Mark, and then in Matthew sometimes that parable is repeated almost verbatim. So there's a very strong textual relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and a bunch of other things. We'll talk about the differences and similarities in the Gospels here shortly. But then there's John, okay? And the Gospel of John is, though it obviously tells basically the same story. It follows, talks about Jesus' life and his death and resurrection and all that sort of stuff. John does it very, very differently, and so we're going to talk about some of those differences today. But when we date the Gospels, most scholars date Mark as the earliest Gospel, and then Matthew and Luke come later, and then John is very, very hard to date. We know that John is dated sometime after AD 70, and we know that because in AD 70, a really important event happened in the life of the Jewish people, which was that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed and Jerusalem was seized by the Romans in AD 70. Okay, and it's pretty clear when you read the Gospel of John closely and you look at the Johannine epistles, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. When you look at those, it's clear that John was writing for a community and in a community that was dealing with the aftermath of the destruction of the temple. Okay, so we know that John is probably written later in the 1st century. Now, as I said, the destruction of the temple was a hugely significant event. You see this in the Gospels themselves, actually, when Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple, and everybody around him is like, no, that can't possibly happen, you're crazy. Because that was an unfathomable thing. The temple had been destroyed once before, which is basically most of the Old Testament, after the first 5 books, has to deal with that whole thing, and certainly the writings of the prophets have to deal with it. Rich, in his earlier Noonday Prayer video, talked about exile. That's all tied up in the destruction of the first temple. And so the destruction of the second temple was something that just was beyond the pale for folks. And when it was destroyed, it just totally upended everything, okay? So at that time, or before then, you had these converts to the faith, and this gets a little tricky because when you talk about the word Christian, it's kind of anachronistic to talk about Christians in the first few decades after Jesus' death and resurrection, because that was a term that would later be applied. But we're just going to use it for now because I don't know any other term to use. So for clarity's sake, talk about Christian converts, okay? Now, when we think of converts to the Christian faith, oftentimes we think of Gentile converts, as this is what Paul was writing about in his letters. Paul was going around the Mediterranean and missionizing all of the Gentiles. But there were also Jews, like the disciples. I mean, Jesus himself was Jewish, right? Who viewed Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God. And you see in Paul's letters that there was a lot of conflict about this, about what parts of the law you should keep and what parts you shouldn't keep and all of that sort of stuff. So for these early Christians that were converts from Judaism, they still kind of viewed themselves as Jewish in a way. They would continue to observe many parts of the law, for instance, or they would continue to go to synagogue with all of their friends in the village and things like that. And so the reason I tell you all this is to say that when the temple was destroyed, all of these Jewish converts to the faith were then cast out of the synagogue. And so it's not just that the temple was destroyed and that was chaotic and upended everybody's life, but also these folks were cast out of their communities, basically. And it's against that backdrop that the Gospel of John is written. Okay, so that's really important to know. So let's keep going. Okay. And you can read a lot more about that in the notes that I will post, but I won't bore you with any more of the history. All of you know, if you've heard me preach, I can get really in the weeds on some of that stuff. Okay, so chief ways that John is different than the synoptics. I already talked about a little bit about how John differs from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but I think it's important for us to think about these things because it impacts the way that we read John, and I think the differences that the ways in which John is different are intentional, and they help shape the way that John wants us to see Jesus, okay? Which is important for us to know. So as I said, synoptic means with one eye, and Matthew, Mark, and Luke share a very strong relationship, both textually and otherwise. Stylistically, you'll notice that there's a big difference. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, even though they aren't like direct reporting, like it's not like they were sitting there with a little notepad like writing this down as it was happening, they read a lot more like direct reporting, right? They read sort of like this, where Jesus and the disciples will be going somewhere, and then they went and did this, and then they went and did this, and then Jesus went and said this parable, and then they went and did this thing, and you just kind of follow the story that way. But John is very different stylistically, and you'll notice that as we continue to read John over the coming weeks. The synoptics are a little bit more focused on and concerned with Jesus' teaching, especially Jesus' teaching about the kingdom of heaven. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are where we get the parables, for instance. There aren't really any parables in the Gospel of John, which is weird. Or at least it's weird if, I guess it's not weird. John did it how he wanted to do it, okay? But there's no parables in the Gospel of John. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke seem more intent on situating and framing Jesus historically, okay? Like, for instance, if you think of the genealogy at the beginning of Matthew, that we all skip over and nobody really reads, but it's actually pretty important. So they want to situate Jesus historically, but you can tell right off the bat from the first verse in the Gospel of John, John is not really interested in that necessarily. John wants to situate Jesus theologically instead of historically. Okay, and that's really important. We do get a number of stories in the Gospel of John that we don't get in the Synoptics. For instance, the wedding at Cana, very popular, very famous story where Jesus turns water into wine at this wedding. That appears in the Gospel of John, but not in the Synoptics. The raising of his friend Lazarus from the dead, also a really important story. We get in the Gospel of John, but not in the Synoptics. So John is really, John gives us a different window into who Jesus is, and more importantly, why Jesus is, because I think that's the real question that John wants us to probe. Let's see. Another thing about the Synoptics and how they're different than John. John is all about Jesus' death and resurrection. It's all about the cross for John. Obviously, the cross figures in the Synoptic Gospels, but not nearly in the same way as they do in the Gospel of, or as it does in the Gospel of John. And we'll continue to explore that in greater depth in the coming weeks. But John is really focused on the cross. Okay, so here are the ways, right? No parables in John. We get some extra stories in John. John is very theological in nature. It wants to root Jesus theologically and less historically. And then John is also all about the cross and the resurrection in John. It's a full half of the gospel is nothing but getting to that moment. So, which brings us very conveniently to the structure of the Gospel of John. I have to do my own transitions. This will not be edited in YouTube later or something like that. Okay, so John has a very, very clear literary structure. John's Gospel is very, very carefully composed. Okay, so in John you have a prologue, a very clear prologue. That's John chapter 1, verses 1 through 18, which is what we'll talk about here very, very shortly for a second. Then you have the first half of the gospel, which is often referred to as the book of signs, where Jesus is going around and doing different things and teaching and healing people. Mostly, it's a lot of healing people, multiplying loaves and fishes, that kind of thing. So Jesus is doing that for the first half, and then in the middle of the gospel kind of turns on the story of the raising of Lazarus from the dead, and at that point it pivots. And the rest of the gospel is all geared towards the cross. It's all the farewell discourses. It's all Jesus preparing for his death, then his death, and then his resurrection. And then at the end, just like there's a little prologue, there's also an epilogue. at the end. Okay, so John is very carefully composed. Um, John also tells us why he's writing his gospel. Okay, John tells us that he's writing his gospel for a specific reason, and that reason is found in John chapter 20, verse 31. And it says this. He says, "But these things are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name." Okay? The reason the Gospel of John is written is so that we may come to believe and have life in Jesus' name. Okay, so the whole Gospel is meant to not only have this theological tone to it, but also a devotional tone, which is why I think it's good to kind of walk through in a setting like this together in community, is because it has that devotional aim. Let's see. Okay, so that brings us to finally the gospel itself. Okay, so one of, to me, the most beautiful and just most epic passages in all of Scripture is the first chapter of the Gospel of John. I think that anytime you open your Bible and you start reading those first words of John chapter 1, "In the beginning was the Word," it's like all of a sudden in my head I sound like James Earl Jones. I don't in real life. I wish I did, because I think that's just how it's supposed to be read. It's just supposed to be read like James Earl Jones. So anyway, so it begins with, it brings us all the way back to the waters of creation, right? It goes all the way back to Genesis. And in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Okay, so already we see that John is doing something very different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Okay, right off the bat. And in this beginning passage, we pretty quickly see that John has two themes that are going to be that are going to go throughout his gospel, starting from chapter 1 and going all the way to the very end. And those two themes, as you may have guessed, because it's also the title of this study, are light and life. Okay, those are two themes that John will pick up again and again, and will kind of make different shades of those themes throughout the entire gospel, but he weaves those two themes throughout. And so we see this in Jesus as, or the Word, like Jesus is the Word made flesh, right? That Jesus is the light of the world that shines in the darkness, and that we are to be bearers of this light, like John the Baptist was. This is part of what happens right in the first chapter of John. And that it is through belief in Jesus that we obtain and enjoy the fullness of life, both now and forever. Okay? And so these are the two themes, as I said, that we will continue to explore throughout this study. But in the meantime, I encourage all of you to read John chapter 1, and even keep going, actually. In 2 weeks, we will be halfway through the Gospel of John. So I encourage you to read John chapter 1 especially. That's what the questions for reflection are going to be on for this week. And then next week, what we will talk about are the 7 signs of Jesus in the Gospel of John, the 7 signs. So, and then we'll talk about, we'll just keep going, okay? So stay tuned. But I'm excited to begin this journey with you. I hope that you've gotten something out of today. Again, I know that was a lot of information thrown at you at once, but I think it's important to kind of have some background and some historical context on the writing of the gospel, the ways that the gospel is different, and the ways that those differences are actually intentional on John's part to help us see certain things about the nature and person of Jesus. I also am excited to walk through this study with you now in this setting, because of course things could not be weirder or more crazy at the moment with all of this that's going on, and I know there's a lot of anxiety and there's a lot of fear. And today, when I was preparing for this study, and I was going back through and adapting my notes and adapting what I was going to say to work in this format a little bit better, and I went back and I read John chapter 1, right? And again, you have this beautiful language at the beginning, but to hear the words, that the light shines in the darkness and the darkness did not overcome it, or that we have received grace upon grace. I don't know. I can't think of a better book of the Bible or a better gospel to walk through together in the midst of a time like this one. And so I hope that you'll join me again next week. Next week's session will be a little bit shorter. I'm going to try to keep these to about 15 minutes or so, but wanted to go through all of that context with you. And again, sorry I couldn't get the stream up and running today as quickly as I'd hoped, but next week we'll be ready to go. And I thank all of you for tuning in. Leave your questions in the comments. I'll get to those. If you have anything you don't want to leave in the comments, feel free to email me, cnations@st-luke's.com, and I'll see you again next week. Thanks.